Okay, so today's lecture is about how do we analyze an organization's strategic resources and capabilities. Now, I would like us to take a look back to last week where we had this one developed, the core areas of strategic management. And as we remember, we had strategic analysis leading on to strategy development, taking us to the implementation part. Now, the first thing we talked about last time was the environment. And we found out that the environment provided us with opportunities and threats. And looking at the resources here, those resources that we have in a company, they provide us with certain strengths and weaknesses when we compare our resources to the environment that we are operating in. So that leads to the SWOT analysis that we also talked about last time. We find it just here. But today, our focus will be on resources that we have right here, and it will also be about vision, mission, and objectives. Now, we'll talk mostly about resources, but we'll also take a closer look at how do we understand vision, mission, and objectives, because there's no just one way to understand this. So when we have finished today, we will have the whole picture of the SWOT and how we develop a SWOT. Okay, let's get started and take a closer look at here, strategic resources. Now, let's start with a little story from before the resource part actually came on. When we had this market-based approach that Michael Porter, amongst others, talked a lot about, we had a very special situation that from the Second World War and forward, lots of the time we had growth. And that meant that companies, when you are operating in a market where you have growth, then you really don't need to take a closer look at your resources, because you simply just take in new resources when you discover a new market, or when the market starts to buy more. You simply just apply more resources because you always have a market that will buy your products or services. So the point at that point of time was that resources were something we used, we bought, but we didn't really take a closer look at them, except that, of course, we needed them in order to produce what we have and would like to sell. And then in the 80s and 90s, we started to have this change, especially in the 90s, where we started to have a closer look at our resources. Also because we started to have some smaller crises. We had an oil crisis. We had different, you could say, situations where nations weren't really having growth markets all over. And that meant that if we would like to save and have money and make a profit, we would have to start looking at our resources here. So the resource-based view is also a consequence of us being in a situation where we need to create profit. And we'll get back to that in a later session. But for now, it's not something that has been there all the time, but resources are certainly important. Now, looking at resources, and we have this individual organization's resources and capabilities. Before I move on talking about this here and talking about Route 1 and Route 2, let's try to make a little experiment by thinking about ourselves. So I would like all of you to think about who you are and what kind of resources and capabilities do you have. Well, as a human being, you have, of course, your brain, you have your limbs, you can do things, and in your brain you can create knowledge, and you can also become good at what you're doing. So you can start to know something about how to cook, for example, and you can read about it. That means you create knowledge about how to cook, and that could be then one of your capabilities. And if you wanted to start up your own little business where you are cooking and selling what you cook, then you might have in your kitchen, you could have different kinds of equipment, and those equipments would be your resources. So imagine you have knives, you have pans, you have a stove, etc. And then you have a little knowledge about what cooking is. Now, would that give you a good position in the marketplace? So you could, for example, take a quick look at this one and say, okay, the knowledge I have, the skills I have, does that really provide me with a competitive advantage? And what about the resources that I have in my kitchen? Are they good enough? Are they big enough? Do I have enough? So in that case, taking it on a personal level, most of us probably, I guess, would say that right now we wouldn't have a competitive advantage because there are other companies who's much better at cooking, and they also probably have a lot more and better equipment, means tangible resources. And what about value added? Well, maybe we don't have a lot of equipment, but we may be extremely good at creating food. And that means that we could maybe add a lot of value to the ingredients that we have. So we may be able to add a lot of value and do it because we have maybe great capabilities. And capabilities comes from knowledge, skills, and competences. So the more competent we get, the more we are capable of probably create more value. So with this little example, I would like to say that an organization and the organization's resources and capabilities is pretty much the same. We simply just scale it up. So when we look at a company and we look at a company's resources and capabilities, we simply try to here, route one, identify, can this company add value and where does it add value? That's one approach. And we do it with those resources that we have. And down here, route two, can this company create a competitive advantage with those resources and capabilities that they have? So this is what we are basically investigating today. That is, can we add value and can we have a competitive advantage with those resources? This means that in order to evaluate whether we can add value or can have a sustainable competitive advantage, we need to take a closer look at these resources and capabilities. But to understand how we are using that analysis, we would have to take these two routes and investigate just a very quick insight in here. So the value added means that we use the value chain, which is Michael Porter, and the value chain is like this one, where we have some parameters that goes into the value chain, and we'll dig into it in a while. But for now, just imagine that a value chain, this is one value chain, and that value chain could be a farmer. So the farmer producing goods, products, milk, meat, has a specific value chain. And that farmer sell the products to dairy. And that dairy here also has its own value chain. And that value chain creates value, hopefully, and may also have a competitive advantage. And that product produced at that dairy is then moved on to the retail level. It could be Bilka, one of the larger chains in Denmark. And Bilka also have their own value chain. And in the end, we out here, us as consumers, we buy products at Bilka. So each company has its own value chain. And when you start to combine these value chains in a row here, then we start talking about it as a value system. So a value system is a connection between different companies' value chains. It can also be the same corporation that owns the different companies. Then we would still talk about a value system, but we simply own it. So having this in place, let's try to take a closer look at the value chain itself, what it consists of. Looking into the value chain, it's important to understand that Michael Porter developed the value chain in the 80s. And he also developed it primarily based on production companies. He didn't really take in service companies. But the content is support activities, means, and here you need to imagine that we simply do our production here. That is this array of activities, which he calls primary activities. And as you can see, it's about operations, it's about logistics, it's about sales, it's about service. And then in order to make all of these activities down here work in the best possible way, he identified what he called here support activities. Now, how can activities in a company support, for example, operations? Well, if we have human resource management, it's about the human resource department to figure out what kind of people and competences do we need in our operations department. It's also about developing policies for how to make it possible for operations to operate without being kind of interrupted by different human resource issues. So the support activities help these primary activities to do what they are best at and create value. Now over here to the right, we have what Porter calls a margin. We would probably just call it a profit because that's basically what it is. So his idea about this value chain is about adding value. So as you remember, the first route was about adding value. And if we take a little example, Coca-Cola, for example, where does a company like Coca-Cola add value? Well, Porter would say, let's try to investigate their inbound logistics. Is it in this operation, this activity, that Coca-Cola is creating a lot of value to themselves? And then we would investigate and say, okay, what is inbound logistics? Well, it's about trucks, it's about making sure that we have things in the right place at the right time, etc. Is that something that really creates a lot of value to Coca-Cola? And we would probably end up saying, not really. It does add some value, but it may not be the best. Okay, then if we look at marketing and sales, what is it that we know Coca-Cola for? Well, we know that it's a brand, it's global. So lots of the things that we pay for when we buy a Coca-Cola is that we pay for the brand. Of course, some would say that we also pay for the taste. And of course, Coca-Cola would say that as well. But where we really create value in a company like Coca-Cola is here in marketing and sales. And also in outbound logistics, because we need a distribution system that will support this. So the outbound logistics and the marketing and sales activities, those really create a lot of value to the company. Imagine that we had Coca-Cola as a company and they did not advertise, they did not promote themselves. What would happen? Well, they have made some research in the US where they have tried to not promote their product in certain areas, and very slowly, actually sometimes fast, their sales go down. So if they do not market themselves and do not spend money and resources on marketing and sales, they do not create value. So in this case, we need to simply understand that the value chain is a way to investigate where does this company add value. Good. Let's look at this one. So that was route 1, value added. Where do we add value in our value chain, our own value chain? And do we also add value because we have a value system, that we have more value chains next to each other? And that leads us to look into specific strategic choices. Okay. Now, let's take a closer look at route 2 here. This is where we start to look into SCA, Sustainable Competitive Advantage. And we simply define it as an advantage over competitors that cannot easily be imitated. Now, looking into our resources and trying to figure out if some of those resources can give us a competitive advantage, then we have these tools here. We have what we call 7 main concepts of sustainable competitive advantage, and we have a Brio paradigm. And we'll get back to what it is, but it's about investigating the resources and figuring out if they can be used to create a competitive advantage. And then we end up having these investigations. We do that in a moment. And then we figure out whether we have some core competences, if we have specific reputation, architecture, knowledge, etc. And then we use that into creating our competitive advantage. Okay, let's try to, of course, we can have the value added and the SCA, they contribute to each other. That's pretty obvious because it's the same resources. But normally we would do the analysis first on route 1 and then route 2. Good. Now, we have this division. We also find that in Lynch, and he would say we would have to start by making an overall analysis of the organization's main resources and capabilities. And how do we do that? Well, his suggestion is, and we see that here, that we simply start out by having a broad survey of our products and our services. And he suggests that we try to look at the size we have, the range and profitability of those main products and services that we have, because that helps us to understand where is it again that we create a margin. That means create a profit. And if we create a profit based on specific products and services, then that indicates that we could probably find value added behind those products and services. So that's one way to investigate. Then we have the competitive position. He suggests, okay, if we want to understand our own position, then try to look into our relative market position. And relative market position could here be understood by, are we stronger or weaker than our competitors? What kind of position do we have in the marketplace? What do customers say about us? Do they rate us higher or lower on certain parameters that we would like to be measured upon? We could also talk about positioning mapping, etc. We could also talk about the relative quality of our service, the relative cost, again, compared to our competitors. Are we stronger? Are we weaker? That gives us kind of a good idea about where we create value in our organization. Then he also suggests us to look at leadership and people. Take a closer look at those skills that they have. And leadership and people, here I would also like to add that when we talk about resources, we have this resource called capabilities. And capabilities, as I said before, comes from knowledge, skills, and competence. So there's a kind of a connection here. If you are knowledgeable about something, you can create a skill within an area. And if you are very skilled, you become competent. And that competence, if you're really good at it, you are really capable. So that's why we are talking about capabilities together with tangible and intangible resources. So people are the ones who possess skills. They can possess new knowledge. They can develop competences, etc. And when we start using those and combining those skills and competences with people in an organization, then the organization can start to have a specific competence and become competent. So we can find lots of added value here in leadership and people. Then the fourth part here, suppliers and customers. He says here the relationship that the organization has with its outside networks. And of course, if you have good networks and you have access to, let's say, knowledge, capabilities, resources that others do not, simply because you have a good network, then that is something that will add value to your organization. But of course, as he also says up here, resources, quite difficult to analyze because many of them are hard to identify specifically. And he also mentions skills and competences. So what we need to do is start looking into it, investigate, and try to understand what it is. Yep. And again, how do we then identify value added? Well, the value added of an organization, and that is if we go back to the value chain that we just saw before, we had this thing called margin. And the margin is also the same as the value added of an organization. And it's simply defined by Porter as the market value of the output minus the cost of its inputs. And then those of you who have had some accounting, etc., you would say, yeah, that's pretty much what we do every year when we are trying to figure out how much profit have we earned, and that is basically it. The point here is that Porter is trying to make us think about where is it that we are adding the value. And then the value chain breaks down these activities into the many parts that we have. We just saw it in the illustration. And then the contribution of each part can be analyzed for its contribution to the total value added by the organization and the SCA. Now, the total value added up here, the total value added of an organization, that's the value of its output minus the value of its input. Okay, that's the total value down here. Now imagine that each part here, each part, that refers to the different activities that we identified before. And I'll just take you back to the slide where we had that one, slide 8 here. Each of these activities, they can also be looked upon as the value of its input and the value of its output. And if you take the value of the output minus the value of its input, you have the value added. So what he's suggesting here is that we, for each of these activities that we have, that we simply try, and we'll go back to this one, and we simply try to identify what is the contribution of each of these parts. And then when we are adding up all of these contributions, that gives us the total value for the whole organization. Only now we know where the value comes from. And then we have the sustainable competitive advantage. And I'll take you back again to this slide here. Sustainable competitive advantage. How can we use a value added analysis to identify a sustainable competitive advantage? Well, as I indicated before, for example, Coca-Cola, marketing and sales, that would probably be a sustainable competitive advantage for them means their marketing and sales skills. And we could probably dig a bit deeper and say they have specific knowledge in the area of doing branding, and they have probably also lots of people who are very competent, and they are very capable within the area of sales and marketing. And that would indicate to us that if they create a lot of value in this area, that this is probably also something that create a lot of competitive advantage to our company. So in that way, the value added analysis help us also to identify what are those resources that will create a competitive advantage to us. Yes. And there it is, just in a large edition, and explained with those examples, added value in the activities, suggesting maybe that we have a competitive advantage in that particular area. Good. That leads us to step 2. So just think back now and say, well, we just looked at this step 1, an overall analysis of the value added by the organization's main resources and capabilities. Simply trying to look into what is it that we are doing, where do we add value, etc. Now in this step 2, we move on to try and understand resources on a more specific level. And we are dividing them into tangible, intangible, and organizational capabilities. So let's try to see what are those different resources. Tangible resources, tangible assets. These are the physical assets that we have. Could be a plant, it could be a location, it could be machinery, it's all the things that we can kind of touch. Then we have those intangible assets that a company might possess. And those resources have no physical presence, but they can provide lots of benefits. And here, examples, brand name is a very obvious thing, and also patents. So intangible assets can be very valuable simply because they are creating a lot of value to the company. Again, think back to Coca-Cola, brand name. Where would Coca-Cola be without its brand name? So the brand name is clearly an asset, and it is intangible. We cannot really touch it, but it is there. Then we have the third, organizational capabilities. And here we have the skills, we have routines, we have management and leadership of the organization. So this is how we could look at resources and try to identify them. What we can do then, and then just remember we have tangible, intangible, and capabilities. I'll just go back to the slide here about the value chain. Click. And if we look at operations, then within operations, we will find that we have tangible resources, we have intangible resources, and we have capabilities. We have people working there, and they have capabilities, knowledge, skills, etc. So understanding operations could be investigating what kind of tangible resources do they have, what kind of intangible resources do they have, and what kind of capabilities do we find there. And we could do that for all the different activities, also for outbound logistics, marketing and sales, and service. We could also do it for the supply activities up here. Same thing. For all of these activities, we could do an analysis of those by simply breaking those activities down, and now I go back down into what are the tangible assets, intangible assets, and the organizational capabilities. Now, taking it a bit further with those different kinds of assets here, resources, we need to understand whether they are good or not so good. And we do that by looking into, for example, a way to understand what is it that make a resource a good resource to help us gain a competitive advantage. Well, these are 7 different areas that Lynch is talking about. And he's saying that we have to analyze resources and capabilities against 7 main elements. And when I translate that, I would say that it is more easy to understand that do we have any resources that is characterized by any of the 7 points below. That means if we have a resource, and let me just take you back to the former slide. If we have a tangible resource, like a plant or a location, or machinery, or tables, or cars, if we have those resources, that plant that we have, is it possible for others to imitate that plant? And the answer might be yes. Okay, then it may not really be a source for creating a competitive advantage to us. Then we have to continue and evaluate our resource plant and say, is it durable? If the answer is yes, it is durable, then we could say, okay, then maybe it can help us to create a competitive advantage. And so forth. We investigate each of those resources up against these 7 elements. And we simply ask the question, do we have any resources that is characterized by any of the 7 points below? Having made that analysis makes it possible to eventually and maybe identify resources that would help us gain a competitive advantage. So that's what we are using this for. A nice analysis takes a long time, and cannot really be sure that we will succeed because it's also quite difficult to identify this. We also have another tool that we can use to identify and analyze resources, and that's in this one. It's called the RIO framework. This is where we have resources and capabilities that we would like to investigate whether they actually live up to 4 criteria. And those 4 criteria are valuable, rare, inimitable, and organized. Now imagine, again, we will go back to your kitchen and you cooking, that you have a kitchen stove. Is that valuable? Yes, maybe, but it might not be that valuable. Is it rare? No. Is it inimitable? No. Is it organized? Yes, probably you might be good at using it. So you can organize the resource into your business, but others might actually be able to do the same. So valuable, rare, inimitable, and organized are the criteria that our resources should meet. And I'll try to make a little example here because I think that makes it easier to understand. Now imagine that we have a production building, that could be a plant again, for a specific company. And in this case, I have taken Vestas, I talked about Vestas before, producing wind turbines. They have lots of production buildings and plants. Are those valuable? They might be, but it's not specifically valuable. Then they also apply, and are those plants rare? No. Are they inimitable? No. Are they organized? Well, maybe they are. We don't really know. But if we're not having valuable resources, or they're rare, or if they're easy to imitate, then it doesn't really go as a resource that will give us a competitive advantage. So that means the production buildings evaluated by asking these questions to this specific resource indicate that it's not something that help us create competitive advantage. Then looking at another resource, CNC machinery. Is it valuable? Yes. Is it rare? No. Is it inimitable, etc.? No, not necessarily. But it could be something that could give us a competitive parity. So that means that it's something that helps us stay in business. Another resource says knowledge. And now here, please remember that resources consist of tangible, intangible, and capabilities. And capabilities includes knowledge. So knowledge on how to build a wind turbine, is that valuable? Yes, it is. Is it rare? Yes, it's pretty rare. Is it not possible to imitate it? Well, it is possible. So it's not something that we can have forever, but it might then give us a short-term competitive advantage. And another resource, in this case, a capability that I have chosen to pick out here, is the capabilities of finding optimal site. And that means finding the site in a country where you can get the highest efficiency out of the wind turbine. That actually takes quite a lot of computer power because you need to investigate climate and wind directions, and lots of different things goes into these computations. Is that valuable? Yes, it is. Is it rare? Yes. Vestas has been the only one for lots of years that has been able to do that quite well. Is it inimitable? Yes, to a certain degree it is, at least over time. And the last point, organized. Is Vestas capable of organizing the knowledge that they have about this? Yes, they are. And that can give a long-term competitive advantage. Now, try to look at this one, organized. Organized means that how do we as a company organize our resources? And who is organizing? People are organizing. Well, if people are not good at organizing the work, then you can have over here lots of good resources, But if the people you have hired and employed, if they don't know how to organize the resources, then it doesn't matter how good your resources are, because then very quickly you will find yourself out of business, because you will start losing money because the wrong decisions will be made. So it's not just a question about whether resources are valuable, rare, etc. It's also, can we take advantage of it? If we cannot do that, then it really doesn't matter what kind of resources we have. Okay, so that's a point to remember. Let's move on to this one. So then we have step 3, where we will start to look into how can these resources here, how can they help us to get innovative capabilities, reputation, architecture, etc. So do not try to look for an exact connection between these resources and here, but simply understand that now we look into how the resources might end helping us to create reputation. And where do we look at it? So we have different kinds of ways to look at it, and we have different researchers. We have John Kay, for example, Hamal and Prahlad, and they are talking about distinctive capabilities, core competences, and knowledge. So this is just a way to understand how our resources come through and can be used in our organization. And we'll try to take a look at these one by one. So distinctive capabilities add value and deliver competitive advantage in 3 areas. And that's what Kay, he says. He says, if a company has a network of relationships, both within and outside the firm, then he would say that's architecture, and that architecture is something that creates value to the company. Also, reputation. If you have a good reputation, that's something that gives you a distinctive capability, and that means you create value. And if you are innovative, you have specific structures, skills, procedures that make the organization innovative, then that's also something that adds value. So these are simple areas that we try to look into, say, okay, given this resource analysis, do we have any architecture that will help us? Do we have reputation? Do we have innovative abilities? Because that might lead us to say, then we have a specific sustainable competitive advantage within this particular area. So these are areas to analyze. These are the things that we are looking for in the organization by looking at our resources. Then Hamal and Prahlad talks about core competences, and they define it as this here, that it's a group of production skills and technologies that enables an organization to provide a particular benefit to customers. Try to look at a group. That means we're bundling things up here, and we are talking about skills and technologies. And what they also try to look at is to say we combine our skills and technologies in a specific way that will give a particular benefit to customers. So we could investigate it in a more specific way by looking down here and say there are 3 distinguishing features. Customer value. If this competence that we're looking at, it must give a real impact on how the customer perceives the organization. It should be differentiating ourselves from the competitors, and we should be able to extend it to use that specific competence, a core competence in other areas. For example, Coca-Cola, they should be able to use their marketing and sales skills in other areas as well to create a value to them. And let's take the last one, knowledge. Here we're talking about very often tacit and explicit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is knowledge that we cannot really express. It may not be written down. And explicit knowledge is something that can be carefully analyzed, and we know exactly what it consists of. It could be a patent, for example. We could have patents on processes, and that would be an explicit knowledge. We could have tacit knowledge. It could be that Coca-Cola do not really know why they're so good at marketing, and that would be a tacit knowledge. Or imagine a salesperson who's really good at selling, but has never told anybody how he or she does it. That would be tacit. And almost done here. Then we start looking at benchmarking, leveraging, upgrading, etc. And I'll just say these are how we move on, having identified what is it that we are building upon, given these resources. So let's take a quick look at those. Benchmarking is about comparing our business to the best of other businesses. It doesn't have to be competitors, because if we compare to our best competitor, we will never be better than our best competitor. And sometimes we would like to be better than our best competitor. So benchmarking is about comparing to others that are better within a specific area. And then we could also look into these areas here in order to figure out how do we take advantage of those resources that we have. I'm not going to dig into these further. And then the sustainable competitive advantage. It could be that we simply is able to differentiate ourselves in the marketplace. That is what the whole analysis tells us, that our resources makes it possible for us to differentiate ourselves, and in that way we create a lot of value to our company. It could also be that we at the same time do niche marketing, that we are really good at focusing at a very specific customer group, and in that way we are taking advantage of our resources. So sustainable competitive advantage and added value, it all ends up with us trying to figure out how can our sources here, how can our analysis of the resources, how can they supply us with an advantage in the marketplace of differentiation, low cost, high performance, etc. So these down here, and there will be others than these. These are just examples. But this is kind of where it ends, because we are trying to figure out how can our resources then help us create this competitive advantage in the marketplace. But we cannot decide on these or figure them out unless we have done the research first.